The story begins in a time of confidence, when the United States stood at the height of rapid change and optimism. The 1920s were years of extraordinary transformation. Cities grew upward with steel and ambition. Factories expanded with relentless energy, and new technologies entered everyday life in ways that had never been imagined before. Automobiles filled the streets, radios brought voices into homes from across the nation, and electric appliances began to reshape domestic life. It was a period where progress seemed not only possible, but guaranteed. And for many Americans, the future felt bright and unstoppable. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, the foundations were not as stable as they appeared. Wealth was not distributed evenly. While some individuals and corporations accumulated great fortunes, many workers struggled to keep pace with rising costs of living.
It's working.
Farmers in particular faced declining crop prices and growing debt. Production had expanded faster than demand, creating imbalance in key sectors of the economy. But these warning signs were often overlooked, overshadowed by a national mood of optimism and speculation.
Can we listen every single night?
The stock market became the centerpiece of this optimism. Investing was no longer limited to the wealthy or experienced financiers. Ordinary citizens began participating, drawn in by stories of rapid profit and easy wealth. Banks and brokers encouraged this enthusiasm, and buying stocks on margin became a widespread practice. People could purchase shares with borrowed money, paying only a fraction upfront, expecting that rising prices would cover the debt. As long as the market continued to climb, the system seemed to reward everyone. For years, it did climb. Stock prices rose far beyond what many companies were actually worth. This disconnect between real economic productivity and market valuation continued to widen. Confidence fed on itself, and speculation replaced caution. But such growth built on expectation rather than stability cannot continue indefinitely. By the late 1920s, uncertainty began to surface. Prices fluctuated more sharply, and some investors quietly began to withdraw. What had once felt like guaranteed growth started to feel fragile.
Before we lose it all.
In October 1929, that fragility became undeniable. The first major shock came on October 24, when panic selling began to spread through the market. Orders to sell overwhelmed buyers, and prices began to fall rapidly. Attempts to stabilize the situation through coordinated purchasing offered only temporary relief. Fear was already taking hold. 5 days later, on October 29th, the situation collapsed completely. Selling became uncontrollable. Billions of dollars in value disappeared in a single day, and what had once been considered wealth turned into loss almost instantly. The collapse of the stock market did not remain confined to trading floors. Its effects spread quickly throughout the entire financial system. Banks, many of which had invested heavily in stocks or extended loans to investors, suddenly found themselves exposed to massive losses. As fear grew, people rushed to withdraw their savings, worried that their money would disappear if banks failed. But banks cannot survive mass withdrawals without sufficient reserves, and one after another began to collapse. When banks failed, deposits vanished with them, destroying the life savings of millions of families. Without access to credit, businesses struggled to operate. Companies that once expanded rapidly were forced to slow production or shut down entirely. Factories reduced hours, then laid off workers, and eventually closed their doors. As unemployment spread, consumer spending declined, which in turn caused further business failures. The economy entered a downward spiral, each failure feeding the next. At first, many believed the downturn would be temporary, a correction similar to those seen in earlier years. But as months passed and conditions worsened, it became clear that this crisis was deeper and more widespread than anything previously experienced. By 1930, unemployment had already reached alarming levels, and by 1931 and 1932, it had become a national catastrophe. Millions of people found themselves without work, without income, and often without hope of immediate recovery. Daily life changed dramatically. Families who had once considered themselves secure were suddenly forced into survival mode. Savings were exhausted quickly. Possessions were sold to pay for food or rent. And when those ran out, many turned to public assistance or charity. In cities across the country, long lines formed outside soup kitchens and relief centers, where people waited for simple meals. Bread and soup became staples of survival for those who had once lived comfortably. Homelessness increased sharply. Entire families were evicted from their homes when they could no longer pay rent or mortgages. Makeshift settlements began to appear in vacant lots, parks, and unused public land. These communities were often built from scrap materials: wood, cardboard, metal sheets, anything that could provide shelter. They became known informally as Hoovervilles, a name reflecting public frustration and blame, directed toward political leadership during the crisis. Life in these settlements was harsh and uncertain. There was little access to clean water. Sanitation was inadequate, and food supplies were inconsistent. Yet within these conditions, people created systems of cooperation. They shared resources, supported one another, and formed fragile but essential communities in the absence of broader support structures. While urban centers struggled with unemployment and poverty, rural America faced its own devastating crisis. Farmers had already been under pressure before the economic collapse, but fallen crop prices made survival even more difficult. Many were unable to repay loans taken during better years, leading to widespread foreclosure and loss of land. Families that had worked their farms for generations were forced to leave. As if economic hardship were not enough, environmental disaster struck the Great Plains. A severe drought combined with decades of poor land management led to massive dust storms that swept across states like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. The soil, once fertile, became dry and loose, easily lifted by strong winds. The result was the Dust Bowl, a period of ecological collapse that turned farmland into barren wasteland. These dust storms were overwhelming in scale. They darkened skies, buried homes, destroyed crops, and made daily life nearly impossible. Families sealed their homes with cloth and tape to keep out the dust, but it still found its way inside. Respiratory illness became common, and many were forced to abandon their land entirely. Large numbers migrated westward, particularly toward California, in search of agricultural work and stability. However, competition for jobs was intense, and living conditions remained difficult.
The babies need to eat.
Across the country, a sense of uncertainty and exhaustion spread. Confidence in institutions weakened. The belief that hard work alone guaranteed success was deeply shaken. People questioned how such widespread failure could occur in a system that had once promised endless opportunity. The psychological impact was as severe as the economic one. Hope became difficult to maintain when every aspect of life seemed unstable. Yet even in this environment of hardship, resilience persisted. Communities organized informal support networks. Churches, charities, and local groups provided assistance where possible. Families shared food and shelter. Individuals helped neighbors survive through cooperation rather than competition. These acts of solidarity did not solve the crisis, but they provided essential human connection during a time of widespread despair.
There's plenty more where that came from.
By 1932, it was clear that more coordinated action was necessary. Economic conditions had not improved, and in many areas they had worsened. In this climate of urgency, political leadership shifted. Franklin D. Roosevelt emerged with a message centered on change and active intervention. His approach marked a departure from previous policies, emphasizing direct government involvement in economic recovery and social support. Once in office, a series of programs and reforms were introduced in rapid succession. The financial system was stabilized through emergency measures aimed at restoring confidence in banks. Regulatory frameworks were established to prevent future speculative excesses and to increase transparency in financial operations. Public works programs were created to provide employment, allowing millions of unemployed individuals to contribute to infrastructure development while earning income. Roads, bridges,
Recovery
dams,
efforts
schools,
nationwide
and
showed
public
promising
buildings were
results.
constructed across the country. These projects
schools
not
and
only
roads are
provided
rising across the
immediate
land.
employment, but also left a lasting physical legacy that continued to serve communities for
Public works
decades.
projects like
At the
this
same
school
time,
are giving hope
support
and
systems for
jobs to
vulnerable
communities
populations
across the
were
nation.
expanded, including assistance for the
From
elderly
hardship,
and
slow path to
unemployed.
recovery begins.
Gradually, conditions
Factories
began
awakened
to
and
improve.
paychecks restored
Recovery was
Your
slow
pay, sir.
and
The bank is
uneven,
open.
Here's
but
your
stability
relief. You're not
returned in
alone.
stages.
remember the scars,
Employment
but look for
increased,
tomorrow.
production resumed,
sun
and financial confidence
bed
slowly rebuilt.
Tonight,
However, the effects of the Depression did not disappear
really have
quickly.
enough now,
The
Pop?
trauma of economic collapse remained
together.
deeply embedded in public
Build it
memory,
back stronger.
shaping attitudes toward money,
come for the
risk,
worst.
and government responsibility for
Have
years
new
to
shoes and
come.
maybe even a bicycle?
By the late 1930s, the global situation began to shift once again. As geopolitical tensions escalated into conflict, the outbreak of a major world war transformed industrial production and labor demand. Factories that had once stood idle now operated at full capacity, producing materials for military and allied support. Employment surged, effectively ending mass unemployment in the United States. By the early 1940s, the long period of economic depression had come to a close. However, its legacy remained profound. It had reshaped the relationship between citizens and government, led to the creation of new financial safeguards, and redefined expectations of economic stability. It also served as a reminder of how interconnected financial systems, environmental conditions, and human behavior truly are. The Great Depression stands not only as an economic collapse, but as a defining chapter in modern history. It revealed the vulnerability of systems built on speculation and imbalance, but it also demonstrated the capacity of individuals and communities to endure under extreme hardship. It is remembered as a time of profound loss, but also of adaptation, reform, and eventual recovery.